Detectives have never seen such brutality and abuse. The story of 2-year-old Koralynn Marie Pfister. What are your thoughts on this crime? Should justice be even harsher for cases like this? Share your opinions in the comments. Subscribe for more true crime stories that need to be heard.
Koralynn Marie Pfister, or as everyone who loved her called her, Monkey. That's what they affectionately called her, because she was always climbing, exploring, and full of energy. A 2-year-old bundle of joy with a smile that could light up a room. A little girl who loved her dinosaur chicken nuggets, just like any kid her age, and could always be found running around with a spark in her eyes, a giggle that was contagious, and a mischievous grin that let you know she was up to something fun. You know, when you think about it, Koralynn was just so innocent, so full of life, so carefree. She hadn't even scratched the surface of the world yet, hadn't even begun to experience what life had to offer. She was just beginning to figure out who she was, to play, to learn, to be loved. It's heartbreaking, really, how quickly her story would turn from one of innocence to one of tragedy. But for now, let's hold on to that image of her laughing and climbing, those happy memories that she deserved to have more of. Imagine a warm afternoon, the kind where the sun's just starting to dip a little, and Koralynn is in the backyard, climbing on everything in sight. It wasn't even a big deal. She was just a little girl doing what little girls do, enjoying the simple joys of childhood. And every time her mother, Becky, looked at her, there was that moment of pride, of love, watching her daughter grow, laugh, explore. The kind of love only a parent knows. Becky would say, "Watch out, little monkey, don't fall." And Koralynn would just laugh and keep going, her energy infectious. But then, like so many stories, there's another side to the picture. Because life wasn't always easy for Koralynn. You see, her parents, Becky and David, didn't stay together. They met in 2008 under what seemed like the best of circumstances. David, a man who had moved from Iowa to Washington to be with Becky. They were hopeful. They were ready to make a life together. But as often happens, life doesn't turn out the way we plan. David worked long hours doing whatever he could to make it work. Becky stayed home with Koralynn and her older sister, just trying to hold everything together. Things seemed fine in the beginning, but soon life threw them curveballs that neither of them saw coming. In August of 2011, David lost his job, and that's when the cracks started to show in their relationship. It was just too much to handle. Bills piled up, stress piled up, and in February 2012, they split up. They agreed to share custody of Koralynn. David would have her on Wednesdays and Thursdays, and Becky would have her the rest of the week. For a little while, it seemed like they were making it work, co-parenting, doing the best they could in a difficult situation. But let's be real here. When life throws you that kind of curveball, things get messy. Becky started to pull away. And David, well, he wasn't just her ex-husband. He was Koralynn's father, and like any father, he wanted to be in his daughter's life. He wanted to make sure she was okay. He wanted to see her grow up, to watch her climb, to share those moments. But as time went on, Becky stopped answering his texts. She became more distant, and David began to feel this deep sense of worry that his daughter was slipping away from him in ways that he couldn't control. He was trying his best, but sometimes, no matter how hard you try, you lose touch with the ones you love. But by April 2012, things had become strained. David hadn't heard from Koralynn for weeks, and that's when he decided he couldn't just wait around any longer. He showed up at the house. It was a Monday, and he demanded to see his daughter. But Becky said no. She wasn't going to let him take her. Koralynn, though, was listening. She heard her dad's voice, and that's when she started to cry, loudly. And when she cried, Becky, unable to ignore it, gave in. She let David take Koralynn for a short visit, just a quick one, thinking it would be no big deal. But for David, that visit was the last time he saw his daughter alive. He had no idea that in those few days, Koralynn was slipping into a situation no child should ever have to face. You see, Becky had allowed someone else to move into their home, James Maurice Reeder, her new live-in boyfriend. He wasn't just some guy, he was a man with a violent past. And here's where the tragedy comes in. David didn't know this, Koralyn's father had no clue that his little girl was being hurt. He thought she was safe. He thought she was okay. And when David was finally able to see his daughter again, he would never see her alive the same way again. As we look back at Koralynn's short life, there's a mix of emotions you can't escape. On one hand, she was that joyful little girl, the one who climbed everything and loved her chicken nuggets. She was the child every parent dreams of, full of hope, full of joy. But on the other hand, she was caught in the middle of a mess, caught between two worlds, her loving father and a mother who was trying her best, but was also drawn into the manipulation of a man who would go to dark lengths to gain control. Koralynn's life didn't have to end this way. It never should have. James Maurice Reeder, on the surface, he was just another guy with a charming smile and smooth talk. He knew exactly how to make anyone feel special. And for Becky Hupel, that was all it took. She was struggling with a broken relationship and the pressure of raising two kids on her own. When James entered her life, he seemed like a lifeline, offering to take care of everything. He wasn't just a boyfriend. He was a partner, cooking, cleaning, and showing interest in her children. It must have felt like a dream come true for Becky, someone who could finally share the burden. For a moment, it felt like everything was going to be okay. But behind his caring facade, there were cracks. James wasn't the selfless helper he appeared to be. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was manipulating. His charm wasn't just about being liked. It was about gaining control. The moment he stepped into Becky's life, he started taking the reins. Slowly, Becky's dependence on him grew until it was hard to tell where her needs ended and his control began. Every decision he made for her, every boundary he crossed, tightened the web he was weaving around her. And she didn't see it, not at first. James suggested taking on more responsibility, claiming he was just trying to help. He had kids of his own after all, so why shouldn't he help with Becky's? But soon Becky began to notice the subtle shift in their dynamic. James wasn't just helping, he was deciding. He made choices for her children, controlled what they did, and subtly isolated her from the world outside. And Becky ignored it. She trusted him more and more, dismissing her gut feeling that something wasn't right. But James had a past, one that wasn't as clean as he let on. His ex-girlfriends had stories of manipulation and violence. James took their phones, accused them of cheating, and when they didn't obey, he became violent. One ex even claimed he had choked her and raped her shortly after she had given birth. These were things James didn't mention to Becky. After all, he was playing the role of the caring, devoted partner. And Becky, desperate for help, never questioned him. But manipulation always escalates. It's never just a small thing. It's a pattern that builds and builds until it reaches a breaking point. James's control over Becky intensified, and by the time she realized what was happening, it was too late. Her daughter Koralynn was already caught in the web. James had taken control of the most important parts of her life, the ones she couldn't afford to lose. And that was the turning point, the moment when everything would crash down. Becky never stood a chance. She couldn't see that the man she had trusted had slowly turned into the predator that would forever change her life and her daughter's fate. And the bruises started showing up. At first, Becky dismissed them. She was just a mother trying to make sense of things. Oh, she must have fallen, she told herself, or maybe she ran into something. But with each new mark, with each new bruise, Becky started to feel that unsettling sense of something being wrong. But she was too deep in her trust for James. She wasn't ready to face the truth. Koralynn's pain, her fear, her confusion, it was building, silently, beneath the surface. And Becky ignored it. She didn't want to believe the truth, because the truth would mean she had let this happen. And that was the part she couldn't bear. It was just another ordinary day for Becky Hupel. She got up, gathered her things, and left the house at 12:30 p.m. to take care of whatever needed to be done. But that day, May 24th, 2012, would change everything. She left her daughter Koralynn, just 2 years old, with her boyfriend James. What should have been a simple afternoon, a mother stepping out for a short time, quickly turned into a nightmare. James, he was there, right? A man who seemed like he had it all together, a man who had always been so helpful, right? He wasn't going to let anything happen. At least that's what he wanted people to believe. So when Becky left, James decided to give Koralynn a bath. And here's where things get strange. Strange enough to make you question everything. He says he stepped out for just a minute to grab a towel. Just a minute, he says. A minute. That's the kind of thing you say when you don't want people asking too many questions. That's the kind of excuse people give when they're trying to cover something up. And here's the thing. Why didn't he call 911 from his own house? Why rush Koralynn to the neighbor's porch, perform CPR, and ask them to call for help when he could have done that from his own front door? Why wait? Why the delay? And then, the moment the neighbors opened that door, that's when the horror began to unfold. Koralynn's tiny body, unclothed, limp, and lifeless, was laid down on the porch as James tried desperately to revive her. And here's where it gets worse, so much worse. Koralynn wasn't just unresponsive. She wasn't just in some unfortunate accident. Her body told a different story, a horrific story. As emergency responders arrived on the scene, they didn't just see a child who drowned in a bathtub. They saw abuse, blunt force trauma to her head, bruises covering her small body, burns and cuts in places where no child should ever be touched, skin missing from her legs, from her toes. Her skin was torn apart, like it had been deliberately ripped away. This wasn't just a drowning. This wasn't just some tragic accident. This was a violent act. And that's when it hit the authorities. The lie. James's story unraveled before their eyes. He had claimed Koralynn had drowned. He told everyone he left the room for a minute, and when he returned, she had slipped under the water. But his story fell apart in that moment, just like the child he claimed to care for. This was no accident. This was the result of months of control, manipulation, and abuse. A life snuffed out in the most brutal way. And as the emergency team worked on Koralynn, trying in vain to bring her back, the truth was already there, staring them in the face. But the worst part, the most gut-wrenching part, the one that stayed with the authorities long after they left the scene, Koralynn had already been dead for a long time before James even thought to call for help. Her body was cold, her temperature dangerously low, far below normal. She had likely been dead for hours before James even acted like he cared. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. Imagine the terror Koralynn must have felt, her body battered, her spirit already broken. And yet, when it came time for James to act, he did nothing. He lied, he delayed, and he did everything he could to cover up the truth. And for what? To save his own skin? The emotional toll this case took on everyone involved, from the investigators to the first responders, is something we can't fully grasp. They had seen abuse before, but this was something different, something much darker. And yet they had to carry on, piecing together the evidence, even as their hearts broke for the little girl who never got to live her life. You can't change the past, but you can learn from it. And the truth is, this story isn't over yet. It's just beginning. His story about a child drowning was starting to seem like a cover-up, an explanation so convenient it was hard to believe. But it wasn't just about the injuries Koralynn had suffered that day. It was about the pattern. The deeper investigators went into James' life, the clearer it became that this wasn't the first time he'd been violent. They started talking to his ex-girlfriends, and the pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. James was no stranger to violence. He had a history of abuse. One ex told detectives about how he'd accused her of cheating, controlled her every move, and when she didn't comply, he'd gotten physical. One woman even shared a disturbing story about how James had choked her, then raped her just days after she gave birth to their child. This wasn't the picture of a caring partner who was just trying to help. No, this was the story of a man who had been hiding his true nature for far too long. But here's the thing that shocked everyone. Becky Hupel, Koralynn's own mother, was left in the dark about the truth, at least at first. She was initially told about the tragic incident, just like anyone else might have been. Her daughter found unconscious in the tub, no one knowing exactly how it happened. But the more she listened, the more her own story didn't add up. How could she not have known? How could she have allowed James into their lives, into Koralynn's life, knowing that he had been alone with her so many times? As detectives began questioning Becky, they started to wonder, was she complicit in all of this? Did she really know the kind of man James was? Or was she too emotionally manipulated to see the truth? Did she believe James's version of events? Or was she just too afraid to face what had really happened? Becky's involvement would be questioned, and rightfully so. She hadn't seen the warning signs. She hadn't seen how James was starting to control her, how he was slowly pushing Koralynn out of the picture, cutting her off from the outside world. But was that her fault? Was she willingly turning a blind eye to her daughter's suffering? Or was she simply too wrapped up in her own insecurities, her own need for someone to lean on? It's hard to say. Becky was a mother who wanted the best for her kids, but somehow she had ended up in the middle of this nightmare. She couldn't see the predator in her own home, because sometimes predators don't wear the masks we expect them to. He was eventually arrested and charged to court. The courtroom was tense. James Reeder was sitting there, stone-faced, as the prosecutor laid out the horrifying details of Koralynn's death, one by one. Homicide by abuse, rape, and possession of meth. The charges were read, and for a moment, there was a flicker of what might have been guilt, but it was quickly replaced by a defensive posture. The man who had taken so much from Koralynn, from Becky, and from so many others now trying to shield himself behind legal jargon. But here's the thing. James knew what he was doing. He wasn't going to fight these charges the way you might expect. He took a different route. James pleaded guilty, but not in the way we'd hope. He took an offered plea. For those who might not know, an offered plea allows the defendant to acknowledge the evidence against them without admitting actual guilt. In essence, it's a plea where the defendant knows they're going to be found guilty, but doesn't have to directly admit it. It's a way for someone to avoid fully facing the truth while still accepting the consequences. James knew the law would catch up with him, but he wasn't about to face the reality of what he had done. And that's what hit the hardest. Here we are, sitting in a courtroom, and James, this man who killed an innocent child and hurt so many others, was allowed to avoid directly admitting to the worst of it. He might as well have been given a clean slate. How is that justice? How does someone like him, someone with a past as violent as his, get to avoid the full weight of his actions? Then came the verdict. The sentence was handed down, and it was clear that this was not the kind of justice Koralynn deserved. James received a sentence of just 37 and a half years in prison, with the potential for parole. And even worse, he was exempt from registering as a sex offender. This was a man who had raped a child, who had broken a mother's heart, and yet the legal system gave him the opportunity to walk free one day. How is that even possible? You see, the issue here wasn't just about James. It was about the broken system that allowed him to slip through the cracks for so long. For a crime this heinous, to get a sentence like that, it leaves you asking, where was the real justice? Where was the true reckoning for the lives he destroyed? For a moment, the court was silent as everyone tried to digest what had just happened. Did this sentence feel like enough? For anyone who was watching, who understood the depths of the tragedy, it sure didn't feel like it. And then, Becky, the moment we've all been waiting for? What about her? She was charged with criminal mistreatment for her role in Koralynn's death, but the charges were much less severe than James's. 1 year and 1 day in jail. And to be honest, that didn't sit well with a lot of people. Is that justice for a mother who turned a blind eye to her daughter's pain? Shouldn't she have been held more accountable for her part in all of this? But there were a lot of people who felt the sentence was too lenient. Was a year enough for a mother who had failed to protect her child? Was it enough considering that Koralynn had endured so much pain and fear in the final months of her life? Would more time have made a difference? Some argued that Becky's cognitive disabilities played a part in the decisions she made. She wasn't the most capable of recognizing the dangers around her, but does that excuse the fact that she allowed her daughter to be alone with a man like James? She had the responsibility to protect her children, and she failed. Some might say, well, she wasn't mentally capable of seeing the signs, but is that enough to wipe away her role in Koralynn's suffering? Should she have been given more time, more understanding, or should she have been held more responsible for her actions? The public was divided on this, and that's what made this case so difficult to reconcile. Becky was not a criminal mastermind, but she was still complicit in what happened. And that made the verdict difficult to swallow. For many, it didn't feel like she had been held accountable. Some felt she deserved more time. After all, her failure to act cost Koralynn her life. So where does that leave us? What does justice truly look like when there's so much gray area? When two people are involved, but only one faces the full weight of the law? How do we find balance when someone like James, with a history of violence and abuse, gets off with such a minimal sentence, and someone like Becky, who failed to protect her daughter, gets off with so little? The truth is there's no clear answer, and that's what makes this case so painfully unresolved. Koralynn's life was stolen, and no matter what the courts decided, no sentence would bring her back. It's not just about what happened in the courtroom. It's about what could have been. The response from the community was nothing short of heartbreaking. A candlelight vigil was held in honor of Koralynn, a small light in a world that felt just a little bit darker. People came together in Washington Park, holding flickering candles, their faces illuminated by the soft light. Each person there mourning the loss of a little girl they'd never truly know. The tributes were simple but powerful, messages of love, messages of sorrow. Koralynn was more than just a victim. She was a symbol of something bigger, something we all should have protected. Her funeral, held privately on June 16, 2012, was a quiet, solemn moment, a painful reminder of the life stolen too soon. The community grieved not just for Koralynn, but for the broken system that allowed her death to happen. So I want to know, should Becky be held accountable for Koralynn's death, or was she just another victim of James's manipulation? Was she complicit, or was she too caught up in a situation she couldn't see? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear from you. What do you think? If you feel the need to keep these stories alive, to give these victims a voice, please subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything, and it helps us keep telling the stories that need to be heard. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you never miss out on future cases. Together, we can make sure that the truth doesn't get buried. Thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.